let's start with Jackson's own opinion on banks.
Okay.
Jackson wasn't opposed to banks. He was opposed to special privilege, governmental privilege, attached to banks. There were, at the United States at the time, a few private banks. That is, people who lent out their own money. And Jackson had no opposition to that. What he had opposition to, again, was banks being clothed by government with privileges and protections that they would not have otherwise. That, as Jackson saw, gave them an unfair advantage over everyone else, and that also gave them political leverage. The second Bank of the United States, and it was the second, the first one was created back in 1791. Congress had let it die in 1811 out of opposition to it. Immediately after that came the War of 1812, and the federal government came within an inch of bankruptcy because it had no financial instrument at its own command. It needed to borrow money. There was nobody there to do it for it. And in 1816, after the war, the second bank was created, and a number of people, including President James Madison at the time, who had opposed the first bank when it was created, frankly said, we learned our lesson. The United States government itself needs a national bank. So the second bank was created in 1816. It had a charter to run until 1836, an act of incorporation. So it was going to have to be renewed. Jackson, when he came into office in 1829, at his first opportunity, surprised everybody. In his first annual message, what today we call a State of the Union message, delivered to Congress in December 1829, and Jackson challenged the Bank of the United States and raised the question of whether it ought to be rechartered when its recharter came up, and made it plain that his answer was no. And he said some pretty astonishing things. He said, the Bank of the United States has failed to provide a national uniform currency. This was one of the things the bank was supposed to do. Again, the federal government, the Treasury had no offices outside of Washington. There was no Federal Reserve. One of the things that the Bank of the United States was entitled to do was to set up branches throughout the United States, which it had done. It was the only national financial institution in the country. All the other banks were chartered by states, only operated within states. If you wanted to send money from Washington to St. Louis, the Bank of the United States, other than taking silver dollars and loading them onto wagons, the only entity to do it, the only organization that had an office in Washington and an office in St. Louis was the Bank of the United States. And the Bank of the United States was authorized by Congress to print paper currency, technically IOUs, but function as money. One of the wonderful things, if you like the banking system, about a bank note issued by the Bank of the United States, $20 Bank of the United States note, no matter where it was issued, would be honored as a $20 note anywhere in the country. Jackson said the Bank of the United States has failed to provide a uniform currency. In fact, it had provided a uniform currency. It was the one thing that everyone knew it had actually done. A congressional committee looked into it and said the Bank of the United States currency is more uniform than gold. Because if you try to carry gold from Washington to St. Louis, there's a carrying charge on it. You can take a piece of paper, a $20 banknote from Washington to St. Louis. It's worth exactly $20, not $20 minus transport costs. $20 flat. So Jackson rather shocked the country, and he suggested that the Bank of the United States ought not to be rechartered. He did not put forth at any time a credible substitute for the Bank of the United States. On the other hand, some of the accusations that he made against the bank about its political meddling proved to be indisputably true. And in fact, during what happened is Congress did pass a bill to recharter the bank. After Jackson announced himself against it in 1829, 30, and 31. Jackson had announced himself against rechartering the bank in his first annual message in 1829, again in 1830, again in 1830, in 1832. A recharter bill passed Congress. There were politics all over this. It was a presidential election year. Jackson's opponent, Henry Clay, was a champion of the bank. There was a calculation on the part of the bank's president, Nicholas Biddle, and Clay, that they were going to put Jackson on the spot, that he wouldn't dare veto a recharter with an election coming up. Jackson did veto it. He'd actually been working on the veto message, as we know from looking at his papers, for 2 years before this. So this was a well-considered act. And the veto message hauled out a whole string of arguments. It argued that a bank was unconstitutional, that the powers of Congress do not include the power to incorporate financial entities. He made some arguments, some kind of jingoistic arguments against the British, which were financially ludicrous. But he also made this powerful argument, the argument that he encapsulated in this one phrase: it is to be regretted that the rich and powerful too often bend the acts of government to their selfish purposes. And that argument was that the bank's stockholders were being endowed by the charter with special privileges, which no one else had, which enabled them to make profits that were in some sense facilitated or even guaranteed by a special relationship with the United States government, and that this was unfair. What then happened, Jackson vetoed the recharter. His veto message was so explosive that both sides distributed it as a campaign document. Jackson was reelected. The veto stood. But the original charter still ran until 1836, so the bank was still there. And then in 1833, Jackson tried to basically defang the bank by pulling all the federal government's own money out of it. The Bank of the United States was the federal government's banker. Jackson pulled all the federal deposits out of the bank. The president of the bank responded by drastically curtailing the bank's business and deliberately setting off a national financial panic, as they called them in those days, and a depression in order to force a recharter. Now, this was exactly the kind of manipulation of the financial system, which the bank controlled, for political ends that Jackson had warned about all along. And the end of this was the bank was not rechartered, folded up its business in 1836. Actually, it got a new charter from the state of Pennsylvania, continued as a state bank, and then got involved in cotton speculation and failed several years later, which thoroughly discredited it.
But it wasn't too big to fail in Pennsylvania.
It wasn't too big to fail in Pennsylvania. The Jacksonians and Martin Van Buren, who was Jackson's hand-picked successor, took the next step. Their slogan was "Divorce of Bank and State." Let the banking system and the federal government have nothing to do with each other whatsoever. And the country actually managed to survive in that way until the Civil War. And at the time of the Civil War, the federal government took the first steps toward controlling the national banking system. And then, of course, half century later, with the Federal Reserve, it took so much further steps. The two balancing sides of this are, on the one hand, and financial historians have said this, they regard Jackson's view as Neanderthal, because a modern economy needs a modern banking system. It needs a central bank. It needs a bank to do what the Federal Reserve does. The federal government needs a financial instrument. It needs somebody to do what the Treasury now does. That's, on the one hand, the needs of a modern economy. On the other hand, there is still the question that Jackson raised, and that is, how do you either keep separate the private banking system and the
federal
function
government.
and the functions of government, and if you don't keep them separate, given how large and powerful and how much money is, given that the entire economy rides on the fate of the banks, how do you deal with the situation that we recently dealt with? How do you solve a financial crisis, a banking crisis, without helping bankers and perhaps helping them at everybody else's expense, with everybody else picking up the tab? That was an issue. I think Andrew Jackson, if he had been around in 2008, would have said, "See, I told you so." This is what happens when banks and government get so intertwined that you cannot separate their interests.
Well, that's very interesting because, as you bring this to a close on his period, and you just reflect superficially but very quickly toward in the future, you say, well, he did it. Abraham Lincoln had his problems with the banks. Both of the Roosevelts had problems and stood up against moneyed people. So, this is an ongoing, recurring theme that, rears its ugly head periodically, every 10 years, every 20 years. And it always seems to reverberate, and the echoes seem historic all the way back to Jackson.
Yeah, and that's very true. For many years, previous to 2008, for several decades previous to 2008, historians looked at the bank war, and it's very complicated. First, the details are complicated, as you've seen. But they looked at it and they said, this is arcane. There's some historical issues from decades, centuries ago that still resonate, where you can say we still see a reflection of this. Historians saw no reflection of this. The banking issue seemed to be resolved. We had a banking system that functioned pretty well, had learned how to deal with minor crises, an occasional bank folding here and there, the savings and loan crisis, the Bear Stearns thing. It seemed like the banking system was stable, and that these big, larger issues, the relation of government and banks, the question of the people's interest in the banking system as opposed to the banker's interest, those issues seem to be dead issues. And we were studying Andrew Jackson's banking crisis, or even the banking crisis in the 1930s, it looked like we were studying ancient history. And then all of a sudden in 2008, all of those old issues were right there.
Yeah.
You could take passages from Jackson's bank veto message in 1832 and stick them into a newspaper editorial in 2008, and no one would know that they weren't written yesterday.
Wow. So we tend to repeat ourselves.
I wouldn't say repeat, but everything is connected. Let's put it that way.
Dan, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I appreciate your time.
Thanks.
It's been a really enlightening experience to sit here with you. Thanks.
Thank you very much.